day, everyone. I am Miss Rochelle Borja, your subject teacher in science. I am going to teach you General Biology 1 for this semester. Today, we are going to learn new things and it's gonna be fun. So, come and let's enjoy learning. Hello everyone! I'm here to discuss the transport mechanisms for our lesson number 7. And our objectives for today's lessons: first, describe the structural components of the cell membrane. Next, relate the structure and composition of the cell membrane to its function. And explain transport mechanisms in cells. Transport mechanisms. So, how do substances move into and out of the cell? Well, cells have plasma membrane that acts like a fence, and this plasma membrane is what regulates what moves into and out of a cell. The membrane is comprised mainly of phospholipid molecules and has protein molecules scattered throughout its structure. The phospholipid molecules have polar hydrophilic water-loving head and two nonpolar hydrophobic water-fearing tails. The membrane is formed as the head face out and the tails face in, forming a bilayer, as you can see here. The inner part of the cell, called the cytosol, is here, and the outside of the cell is surrounded by a fluid called interstitial fluid. Substances move into and out of a cell through several different processes called membrane transport. There are two main processes: passive transport processes and the active transport processes. The main difference between the two is that passive processes do not require energy expenditure and the active processes do require the cells to expend energy. Let's start by looking at the passive processes, which include simple diffusion, facilitated diffusion, and osmosis. Diffusion is the movement of a substance from where it has a high concentration to where it has low concentration, or the tendency of a substance to spread out evenly over a given space. For instance, when a sugar cube is dissolved in water, over time, the cube will dissolve and eventually spread out evenly in the water until it reaches equilibrium. Diffusion occurs down a concentration gradient, which is a difference in concentration of a substance between two areas. So the sugar molecules will move from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. Cellular diffusion is when diffusion of a solute, which is a dissolved substance, occurs across the plasma membrane from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. This is dependent on the concentration of the substance in the interstitial fluid outside the cell and the cytosol inside the cell. This can occur through simple diffusion or facilitated diffusion. Simple diffusion occurs with solutes that are small and nonpolar. By being nonpolar, they can move in between phospholipid molecules that form the plasma membrane because the interior region of the membrane is nonpolar. Some of the materials that move by simple diffusion include the gases of oxygen and carbon dioxide and small fatty acids. So if there is a high concentration of oxygen, O2 molecules outside of a cell, they can move down the concentration gradient across the membrane without assistance, and as long as the concentration gradient exists. And if there is a higher concentration of carbon dioxide or CO2 molecules inside a cell, they can move across the membrane without assistance out of cell into the interstitial fluid. So again, simple diffusion is when nonpolar molecules pass directly through membrane. The second type of diffusion is facilitated diffusion. This applies to solutes that are small and either charged or polar. Because these solutes are polar, the nonpolar phospholipid bilayers blocks them from passing through the membrane into or out of the cell by simple diffusion. However, they can pass into and out of the cell with the assistance of plasma membrane proteins through a process called facilitated diffusion. Now, for osmosis. Osmosis is the passive movement of water through a selective permeable membrane. This occurs when there is a difference in concentration of water on either side of the membrane. This can happen in one of two ways. Water can slip between the phospholipid molecules that make up the plasma membrane or through integral protein water channels that are called aquaporins. The plasma membrane is not permeable to most solutes such as charged, polar, and large substances. Now, let's look at active processes. Active processes require the use of cellular energy for membrane transport. There are two types of active processes. We have the active transport and the vesicular transport. Active transport is the movement of a solute against its concentration gradient or going from an area of low concentration to a place of higher concentration. Vesicular transport involves the transport of large substances such as proteins or large carbohydrates polysaccharides across the plasma membrane. There are two types of vesicular transport, exocytosis and endocytosis. In exocytosis, materials are secreted from the cell to the interstitial fluid outside of the cell. Typically, membranous vesicles formed by the Golgi apparatus transport materials to the cell's membrane. At the membrane, the phospholipid molecules that make up the vesicle fuse the phospholipid molecules that make up the plasma membrane, and the contents of the vesicles are released outside of the cell. The vesicle membrane now becomes part of the plasma membrane. In endocytosis, the plasma membrane kind of traps a substance by folding inward. The lipids bilayer then fuses to form a vesicle surrounding the substance. One last thing to note, both vesicular transport processes and endocytosis and exocytosis require energy. And that be the basics on transport across a membrane. Thank you for watching.